Welcome back to DC EKG with Eric Euland and myself, Joe Grogan, continuing the discussion with Tyler Goodspeed. Tyler, in our last discussion, we were talking a little bit about the U.S. economy, or a lot about the U.S. economy, and you touched upon this idea of Joe Sixpack, John Q. Public, understanding more about inflationary environments than the experts and academia frequently, or the talking heads. It kind of highlights the fact that we're in, maybe they're the tip of the spear, or I don't want to mix my metaphors, but like they're the nerve endings about what's really going on in the economy. And a lot of Americans, the majority of Americans, have never been in an economy like this where inflation is so high and persistent. Personally, I'm older than you. My entire adult life has been low interest rates. So I'm accustomed to credit card decisions, home buying decisions, car buying decisions, shopping based upon that environment. And, going to the farmer's market or the grocery store with my kids, it's interesting to watch them react. They're noticing price increases in real time as myself. I mean, and they're young, they're little. Can you talk a little bit about this phenomenon of, first of all, the consumer knowing more than the experts, and second of all, what do you think about this real-time education Americans are going to be getting on inflation moving forward and how it might be disruptive?
Yeah, so it's really fascinating. I started looking at researching this late last year, because we had some survey data going all the way back to 1960 of consumers, and we actually have survey data of professional economists going back to 1946, and so we can do apples to apples comparisons going back to 1960, and it's super interesting to know that the pros do an okay job. They're certainly much more accurate than consumers over the long term. I can't reject the hypothesis that their average error is zero, meaning they're unbiased. They're over-predicting inflation as often as they're under-predicting inflation. But that performance of the experts is entirely driven by periods of low and stable inflation. When inflation is high and when inflation is changing substantially. So either you're moving from low and stable to high inflation, or you're moving from high inflation to disinflation, such as in the 1980s. Not only do the consumers do a better job than the experts, the consumers are also passing every standard statistical test of a good forecast. So there are errors. If they make a mistake in forecasting inflation, that error is not persisting, they're correcting. Actual inflation is moving one for one with the consumer's forecast. So that I think is really interesting, that once inflation gets above a certain threshold, the consumers are really paying attention to it. They're incorporating it into their everyday decision making. That actually makes the task of getting inflation back under control much more difficult, because inflation is embedded in expectations. High inflation is embedded in expectations. Curiously enough, the experts who did the worst in forecasting the great inflation of the 1960s and 1970s were academics and government economists and Federal Reserve economists specifically.
Do you have any thesis why that was and perhaps is today? After all, the Biden administration forecast inflation a year ago at 2.3% in its budget, and then this year at 2.4% in its budget. So they too have already blown the call twice, pretty dramatically.
Yeah, so I have two explanations. One is lack of sufficient skin in the game. So consumers have a lot of skin in the game to get inflation right once inflation has become quite noticeable, because they have a budget constraint, and higher groceries, higher rent, higher gas impinges on that budget constraint. The professionals who did the best in forecasting high inflation in the 1960s and 1970s were economists with labor organizations. Now, why might that be? Well, if you're in the business of negotiating multi-year wage contracts for thousands of union workers, you should probably have a pretty darn good idea of what you think prices are going to do over the coming years. And so that's one hypothesis, is that skin in the game counts. And actually, over the long run, the experts with commercial banks do an okay job. And I think theirs because, you know, if you're in the business of extending multi-year home loans, personal loans, home mortgages, then you should probably
Know a little
invest in
something about
figuring out.
inflation. Right.
Right.
Yeah. What's going to happen over the next 30 years.
The other factor is that a lot of the academic and government and Fed economists rely heavily on models. And models can mathematical models, and I think, or statistical models. And so I think models can do a good job predicting macroeconomic variables when those macroeconomic variables are moving in a very stable, consistent way. But they really struggle to perceive or detect regime changes because they're based on historical data.
Yeah, we should have a conversation about models, COVID transmission models and illness models, statistical models for economics, but climate change models. I mean, all these models it'd be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, especially because as you just pointed out, they're so weighed down by looking backwards. Mm-hmm. They have so much prevalence towards valuing and probably overvaluing historical experience and past trends rather than attempting truly to look forward based on current circumstances and a smart appreciation about trends and what could happen over the next medium range or long range.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I consider myself an historian as well as an economist, because sometimes, you know, the model's not going to know this stuff. I mean, the model, if you estimate it over the past 20 years, as Joe said, we've had low and stable inflation since the mid 1980s. So a statistical model, an econometric model, is just not going to. It's going to see a blip in inflation and think we're going to have mean reversion. Whereas if you've studied the experience of the 1960s, 1970s, you have a sense of what the trajectory might be.
Right. And certainly when it comes to inflation right now, again, for example, Congressional Budget Office, that's exactly in their forecast. They come back to a median that's based on what's happened over the past 30 plus years.
Right. So let's talk about moving forward for a second, Tyler. I mean, you as a historian, if we look at our debt to GDP ratio, the only time we've had last time we've had a level like this, I mean, maybe you can go back further, but last time is World War II. So the last time we had a debt to GDP ratio like this, we were in a existential conflict against mass murdering psychopaths in Japan and Germany. And we've been relatively peaceful, prosperous, and yet we have managed to spend an inordinate amount of money. And how worried are you about this and the commitments we've made, not just the money that's spent, but the commitments we've made moving forward? Where do you see this ending? It does not look like we are going to have zero deficits moving forward. It does not look like we're going to be able to pay off the debt. How do you view debt and the debt to GDP ratio and what it may do to the U.S. economy moving forward?
Right. And the experience of the period after 1945 is on the one hand encouraging, but unfortunately probably not to be replicated, because we had over a 20-year period after 1945, we rapidly reduced our debt to GDP ratio by about 80 percentage points. And we did it in part with some surprise inflation. I wouldn't recommend doing that. I mean, that is just a massive, talk about a tax, that is a massive redistribution of resources to debtors. And the biggest debtor in the world is the United States federal government. We did it in part with what's called financial repression, things like maintaining capital controls. I wouldn't recommend that at all. I think that's not healthy for capital markets. But we also did it through higher growth. Actually, a substantial portion of the reduction in our debt to GDP ratio was from higher growth. Unfortunately, the growth tailwinds that we had in the aftermath of 1945 are probably more like headwinds today. So one was favorable demographics. We had a population boom. We had rising female labor force participation. And we had a big productivity growth surge in the aftermath of 1945. Unfortunately, today we have some demographic challenges. We have the peak cohorts of the baby boom generation reaching retirement. We have low, and actually for males, we have declining prime age labor force participation, and we've had very weak productivity growth. In fact, over the past year, we've had terribly negative productivity growth. We kind of reversed that trend in 2018, 2019 under the Trump administration, but now we seem to be back in a low productivity growth world. So I think it's hard to grow your way out of debt with those growth headwinds. In terms of, am I worried about this? I mean, yes, I'm worried. I'm worried more today than I was a couple of years ago, because one of the somewhat negative effects of low and stable interest rates was that it meant the United States federal government could borrow substantially at relatively low cost. That was quite sustainable. But in a rising rate environment, in fact, you could probably say that a debt to GDP ratio of 80% or 90% in 2019 was possibly more sustainable than that debt to GDP ratio of 40% in 1983, simply because of the cost of servicing that debt. But now with rising rates, I think it really complicates the fiscal picture moving forward, because we have $30 trillion in federal government debt outstanding. So every 1 percentage point increase in interest rates, that's $300 billion extra a year in interest payments. That's a lot.
It sure is. And our first segment, we talked a little bit about, or a lot, I should say, about Liz Truss and her effort to go for growth. Now we're here talking a little bit about the United States and the need to go for growth as part of dealing with pretty significant debt and deficit problems. Over the course of the next couple of years, Republicans will control one house of Congress. Democrats will have control of the other house of Congress. You've got a Democratic president. What should Republicans be thinking about trying to do here in controlling, one half of 1/3 of the government in Congress, as well as setting the stage for 2024 and hopefully being in charge again in 2025, the sorts of policies that we should be talking about? You listed out a few in the last segment. I'm just wondering how folks should be maneuvering here over the next 24 months up on Capitol Hill if you were giving them advice.
So I think that there's no such thing as a free lunch, but there are relatively cheap lunches. And one of the relatively cheap lunches, at least from a revenue perspective, is a deregulatory agenda. I mentioned the importance of a deregulatory agenda on the domestic energy production front, but there are a lot of areas in which one could return to the type of deregulatory agenda we were pursuing in the Trump administration, including, of course, healthcare. But I think that's something that Republicans could be prioritizing. The other thing is, when I'm looking at the supply side of the U.S. economy, because to get growth, you need to increase the productive potential of the U.S. economy. So I would be eyeing things like the expensing of equipment investment that I mentioned. So if you buy a new piece of machinery, you can write that off in the year in which you incur the cost, but also probably to expand that to include other asset types, things like structures. So that's commercial buildings, that's mines, that's oil rigs. So when you invest in one of these expensive pieces of productive capital equipment, you can write that off from your tax liability. And I would look to incentivize increased labor force participation, not only with making some of those marginal personal income tax rates permanent, but also to be thinking about certain benefit programs to which it might be appropriate, might make sense to attach work requirements. So I think those would be off the bat some things that I would be prioritizing. And if you want to offset some of the static revenue costs of some of these tax provisions, I'll give you two right now. One is to fully eliminate the state and local tax deduction, and the second would be to probably fully eliminate the mortgage interest deduction. Those are two very expensive tax expenditures that disproportionately benefit the highest income households in high tax, high regulation states. And those two, just eliminating those two provisions alone could completely offset the static revenue cost of the investment expensing provisions that I just suggested.
Meanwhile, though, you've got the Democratic leadership coming from high tax blue states, and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi, Hakeem Jeffries. The feds, the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac said they're going to be backing even higher value mortgages now in order to benefit blue states and real estate purchasers of $1 million homes. So it doesn't seem like the Biden administration is going to take your advice on, or at least the Democrats are going to go along with that if the Republicans push on it. But clearly the SALT deduction elimination. There was a 10-year shutdown, right, Tyler, that Trump pushed?
It was until December. So the bill was passed December 2017, and that provision expires December 31st, 2025.
Got it. Okay. Look, we don't have a lot of time left, but just briefly, do you want to talk a little bit? Is this going to imperil the reserve currency of the U.S. dollar? The currency status? Will China take over? It seems like there's a lot of, sick economies. How dangerous is this situation for the U.S. to get dethroned as the premier economic power right now with the world's reserve currency?
On the China question first, I don't envision the renminbi becoming a serious rival to the US dollar anytime soon, because at the end of the day, China maintains capital controls. So they control your ability to bring capital into China or out of China. So in the 2000s, China was trying to prevent capital inflows. Over the past 7-8 years or so, they've been trying to prevent capital from leaving China. So that makes it very, very unlikely that the renminbi is going to become a serious challenger to the dollar, because you need liquid, open capital markets in order to be a reserve currency. In terms of other rivals, I think the only serious rival at the moment would be the European Union, because they have an open capital account. They have a deep and liquid market for sovereign debt and other financial instruments, but it's nowhere near as deep or as liquid as the market for US Treasuries, because it's fragmented. So there's no common European Union debt. There's Italian debt, there's German debt, and those markets are big, but they're just nowhere near as big as the market for US Treasuries. However, that said, go ahead.
I was going to ask, lots of people at least talk a little bit about what's going on in cryptocurrency and, these new sorts of instruments. Are those a potential alternative down the line for the dollar and our role as a reserve currency?
I'm skeptical of that, simply because we've seen since the Russian invasion of Ukraine that Western monetary authorities do have a capacity to intercept some of those assets if push comes to shove. However, I do think that the extensive use of our ability to sanction financial entities, our ability to impose third-party sanctions, utilizing the dollar's central role in the global economy, has incentivized and will continue to incentivize other central banks to diversify their reserve holdings. We've sort of seen that already with a lot of nefarious regimes, including China's, Iran's, Venezuela's, Russia's. And I think that we'll see more of that, just to sort of try to hedge your bets a little bit by diversifying your portfolio of reserve currencies and reserve assets.
Okay, so we are over time. Last question. It's got to be very brief. Favorite movie about any financial situation or event? Trading Places. What's your favorite financial movie?
You know what? I was gonna say perhaps Wall Street or Margin Call, but now that I think about it, I'm probably gonna have to say Mary Poppins.
And why is that?
Because I like the idea. They're in the bank and they have the tuppence, and the tuppence is going to go finance railroads and shipping and all sorts of things around the world. And then there's a little bit of a lesson on how bank runs get started in there. So I actually think I'll have to say Mary Poppins.
All right. That's great. Maybe I should have thought of It's a Wonderful Life when I thought about that question. Yeah. Tyler, this is great. I look forward to a future conversation. I'm sure Eric does too.
Absolutely.
This is always a blast for me, and I always leave these conversations with plenty to think about. Thanks for coming on DC EKG.
Hey, great chatting with you guys.
Thanks, Tyler. Appreciate it.
Thanks.